Oh, hey, besties, and welcome back. Today I'm going to be continuing reading Wuthering Heights by E.Bronte, and basically we're up to the second half of the book. So before I get started, I just want to say that yesterday was my birthday. I had a very good birthday, and I did a couple of really nice things and I really enjoyed it. And I just wanted to say thank you for the well wishes from people. That was really sweet. And so yesterday I turned 43. So it's a big old age. So do I feel grown up? No. Just boiling the kettle, by the way. And putting my phone on charge. So yeah, I just feel really happy because it's birthday week. So whenever I have a birthday, I celebrate it for a whole week, not just a day. Just because, why not? That's what's done in my family. So, well, that kettle's really loud. Sorry about that, besties. Just gonna make a cup of tea. Should I have coffee? I don't know. We're gonna start off with coffee, I think. I usually have it black, but today I've got a sweet tooth, so I'm going to have half a spoon of sugar. Yep, where am I putting everything? Back where it came from. Here we go. And I don't usually have milk either. Don't usually have milk or sugar, but just the last day I've had a bit of a sweet tooth and I thought, why not? It's my birthday week. I'll have some milk and sugar. Be careful, my kettle's broken. Everything's broken, I swear it. Anyway, top that up nicely. And I'd say we're just about ready to start reading. If you hear any noises in the background, my housemates are up and about, and so are my neighbours. So enjoy the not so quiet book reading, but hey, whatever. Shall we get the camera organised? Right, let's see, what were we up to? So we're up to the second part of the book. Here we go. It's before that. Volume 2. So yeah, the book is split into two parts. So part 2 of volume 2, chapter 1 of volume 2. So I'll just launch back into it. I'm having an anxiety attack, and probably doesn't look like I'm having an anxiety attack, but do you know what I mean? Like, you're about to start something and you're like, oh my God, I'm so nervous. And that's me right now, right before I read the book. So I hope that really doesn't carry through, because it's supposed to be a relaxing experience to listen to. So just, I'll try my best, besties. Here we go. Pardon me. Another week over, and I am so many days nearer health and spring. I've now heard all my neighbours' history at different sittings, as the housekeeper could spare time from more important occupations. I'll continue it in her own words, only a little condensed. She is, on the whole, a very fair narrator, and I don't think I could improvise her style. In the evening, she said, the evening of my visit to the Heights, I knew as well as if I saw him that Mr. Heathcliff was about the place, and I shunned going out because I still carried his letter in my pocket and didn't want to be threatened or teased any more. I had made up my mind not to give it till my master went somewhere, as I could not guess how its receipt would affect Catherine. The consequence was that it did not reach her before the lapse of 3 days. The fourth was Sunday, and I brought it into her room after the family were gone to church. There was a manservant left to keep the house with me, and we generally made a practice of locking the doors during the hours of service, but on that occasion the weather was so warm and pleasant that I set them wide open, and to fulfill my engagement, as I knew would be coming, I told my companion that the mistress wished very much for some oranges, and he must run over to the village and get a few to be paid for on the morrow. He departed, and I went upstairs. Mrs. Linton sat in a loose white dress with a light shawl over her shoulders. In the recess of the open window, as usual, her thick long hair had been partly removed at the beginning of her illness, and now she wore it simply combed in its natural tresses over her temples and neck. Her appearance was altered, and I had told Heathcliff, but when she was calm, there seemed unearthly beauty in the change. The flash of her eyes had been succeeded by a dreamy and melancholy softness. They no longer gave the impression of looking at the objects around her. They appeared always to gaze beyond, and far beyond. You would have said, out of this world. Then the paleness of her face, its haggard aspect having vanished as she recovered flesh, and the peculiar expression arising from her mental state, though painfully suggestive of their causes, added to the touching interest which she weakened, and invariably to me, I know, and to any person who saw her, I should think, refuted more tangible proofs of convalescence and stamped her as one doomed to decay. A book lay spread on the sill before her, and the scarcely perceptible wind fluttered its leaves at intervals. I believe Linton had laid it there, for she never endeavoured to divert herself with reading or occupation of any kind, and he would spend many an hour in trying to entice her attention to some subject which had formerly been her amusement. She was conscious of his aim, and in her better moods endeavoured his efforts placidly, only showing their uselessness by now and then suppressing a wearied sigh and checking him at last with the saddest of smiles and kisses. At other times she would turn petulantly away and hide her face in her hands, or even push him off angrily, and then he took care to let her alone, for he was certain of doing no good. Gimmerton Chapel bells were still ringing, and the full mellow flow of the beck in the valley came soothingly on the ear. It was a sweet substitute for the yet absent murmur of the summer foliage, which drowned the music about the grange when the trees were in leaf. At Wuthering Heights it always sounded on quiet days following a great thaw or a season of steady rain. And of Wuthering Heights Catherine was thinking as she listened, that is, if she thought or listened at all. But she had the vague, distant look mentioned before, which expressed no recognition of material things, either by ear or eye. "There's a letter for you, Mrs. Linton," I said, gently inserting it in one hand that rested on her knee. "You must read it immediately because it wants an answer. Shall I break the seal?" "Yes," she answered, without altering the direction of her eyes. I opened it. It was very short. "Now," I continued, "read it." She drew away her hand and let it fall. I replaced it in her lap and stood waiting till it should please her to glance down. But that movement was so long delayed that at last I resumed. "Must I read it, ma'am? It is from Heathcliff." There was a start and a troubled gleam of recollection and a struggle to arrange her ideas. She lifted the letter and seemed to peruse it, and then she came to the signature she signed, and yet still I found she had not gathered its import, for upon my desiring to hear her reply, she merely pointed to the name, and gazed at me with mournful and questioning eagerness. "Well, he wishes to see you," said I, guessing her need of an interpreter. "He's in the garden by this time, and impatient to know what answer I shall bring." As I spoke, I observed a large dog lying on the sunny grass beneath raise its ears, as if about to bark. and then, smoothing them back, announced by a wag of the tail that someone approached whom it did not consider a stranger. Mrs. Linton bent forward and listened breathlessly. The minute after a step traversed the hall, the open house was too tempting for Heathcliff to resist walking in. Most likely he supposed that I was inclined to shirk my promise, and so resolved to trust to his own audacity. Pardon me. With straining eagerness, Catherine gazed towards the entrance of her chamber. He did not hit the right room directly. She mentioned me to admit him, but he found it out. Ere I could reach the door, and in stride or two was at her side, and had grasped in his arms. He neither spoke nor loosed his hold for some 5 minutes, during which period he bestowed more kisses than ever he gave in his lifetime before. I dare say, but then my mistress had kissed him first, and plainly saw that he could hardly bear, for downright agony, to look into her face. The same conviction had stricken him as me. From the instant he beheld her, that there was no prospect of ultimate recovery there. She was fated, sure to die. "Oh, Cathy, oh, my life, how can I bear it?" was the first sentence he uttered, in a tone that did not seek to disguise his despair. And now he stared at her so earnestly that I thought the very intensity of his gaze would bring tears into his eyes, but they burned with anguish. They did not melt. "What now?" said Catherine, leaning back and returning his look with a sudden clouded brow. Her humour was a mere vein for constantly varying caprices. "You and Edgar have broken my heart, Heathcliff, and you both came to bewail the deed to me. And if you were the people to be pitied, I shall not pity you, not I. You have killed me, and I thrive on it, I think. How strong you are! How many years do you mean to live after I am gone?" Heathcliff had knelt on one knee to embrace her. He attempted to rise, but she seized his hair and kept him down. "I wish I could hold you," she continued bitterly, "till we were both dead. I shouldn't care what you suffered. I care nothing for your sufferings. Why shouldn't you suffer? I do. Will you forget me? Will you be happy when I am in the earth? Will you say 20 years hence, that's the grave of Catherine Earnshaw? I loved her long ago, and was wretched to lose her, but it is past. I've loved many others since. My children are dearer to me than she was, and at death I should not rejoice that I am going to her. I shall be sorry that I must leave them. Will you say so, Heathcliff?" "Don't torture me till I am as mad as yourself," cried he, wrenching his head free and grinding his teeth. The two, to a cool spectator, made a strange and fearful picture. Well might Catherine deem that heaven would be a land of exile to her, unless, with her mortal body, she cast away her mortal character also. Her present countenance had a wild vindictiveness in its white cheek, and a bloodless lip, and scintillating eye, and she retained in her closed fingers a portion of the locks she had been grasping. As to her companion, while raising himself with one hand, he had taken her arm with the other, and so inadequate with his stock of gentleness to the requirements of her condition, that on his letting go I saw 4 distinct impressions left blue in the colourless skin. "Are you possessed with a devil?" he pursued savagely, "to talk in that manner to me when you are dying? Do you reflect that all those words will be branded in my memory and eating deeper eternally after you have left me? You know you lie to say I have killed you, and Catherine, you know that I could as soon forget you as my existence. It is not sufficient for your infernal selfishness that while you're at peace I should writhe in the torments of hell." "I shall not be at peace," moaned Catherine, recalling a sense of physical weakness by the violent, unequal throbbing of her heart, which beat visibly and audibly under this excess of agitation. She said nothing further till paroxysm was over. Then she continued more kindly. "I'm not wishing you greater torment than I have, Heathcliff. I only wish us never to be parted, and should a word of mine distress you hereafter, think I feel the same distress underground, and for my own sake forgive me. Come here and kneel down again. You never harmed me in your life. Nay, if you nurse anger, that will be worse to remember than my harsh words. Won't you come here again? Do." Heathcliff went to the back of her chair and leaned over, but not so far as to let her see his face, which was livid with emotion. She bent round to look at him. He would not permit it. Turning abruptly, he walked to the fireplace, where he stood silent with his back towards us. Mrs. Linton's glance followed him suspiciously. Every movement woke a new sentiment in her. After a pause and a prolonged gaze, she resumed, addressing me in accents of indignant disappointment. "Oh, you see, Nelly, he would not relent a moment to keep me out of the grave. That is how I am loved. Well, never mind, that is not my Heathcliff. I shall love mine yet and take him with me. He's in my soul, and," added she musingly, "the thing that irks me most in this shattered prison after all. I'm tired of being enclosed here. I'm wearying to escape into that glorious world, and to be always there, not seeing it dimly through tears, and yearning for it's through the walls of an aching heart, but really with it and in it. Nelly, you think you are better and more fortunate than I, in full health and strength. You are sorry for me. Very soon that will be altered. I shall be sorry for you. I shall be incomparably beyond and above you all. I wonder, he won't be near me," she went on to herself. "I thought he wished it, Heathcliff dear. You should not be sullen now. Do come to me, Heathcliff." In her eagerness, she rose and supported herself on the arm of the chair. At the earnest appeal, he turned to her, looking absolutely desperate. His eyes, wide and wet at last, flashed fiercely on her. His breast heaved convulsively. An instant they held asunder, and then how they met I hardly saw, but Catherine made a spring, and he caught her, and they were locked in an embrace from which I thought my mistress would never be released alive. In fact, to my eyes she seemed directly insensible. He flung himself into the nearest seat, and on my approaching hurriedly to ascertain if she had fainted, he gnashed at me and foamed like a mad dog, and gathered her to him with greedy jealousy. I did not feel as if I were in the company of a creature of my own species. It appeared that he would not understand, though I spoke to him, so I stood off and held my tongue in great perplexity. A movement of Catherine's relieved me a little presently. She put up her hand to clasp his neck and bring her cheek to his. As he held her, while he in return, covering her with frantic caresses, said wildly, "You teach me now how cruel you've been, cruel and false. Why did you despise me? Why did you betray your own heart, Cathy? I have not one word of comfort. You deserve this. You have killed yourself. Yes, may you kiss me and cry and wring out my kisses and tears. They'll blight you, they'll damn you. You loved me. Then what right had you to leave me? What right? Answer me, for the poor fancy you felt for Linton, because misery and degradation and death and nothing that God or Satan could inflict would have parted us. You, of your own will, did it. I have not broken your heart, you have broken it, and in breaking it you have broken mine. So much the worse for me that I am strong. Do I want to live? What kind of living will it be when you, oh God, would you like to live with your soul in the grave? Let me alone, sobbed Catherine. If I've done wrong, I'm dying for it. It is enough. You left me too, but I won't upbraid you. I forgive you. Forgive me. It is hard to forgive and to look at those eyes and feel those wasted hands, he answered. Kiss me again and don't let me see your eyes. I forgive you for what you have done to me. I love my murderer, but yours, how can I? They were silent, their faces hid against each other and washed by each other's tears. At least I suppose the weeping was on both sides, as it seemed Heathcliff could weep on a great occasion like this. I grew very uncomfortable meanwhile, for the afternoon wore fast away. The man whom I had sent off returned from his errand, and I could distinguish by the shine of the westering sun up the valley a concourse thickening outside Gimmerton Chapel porch. Service is over, I announced. My master will be here in half an hour. Heathcliff groaned a curse and strained Catherine closer. She never moved. Ere long I perceived a group of servants passing upon the road. towards the kitchen wing. Mr. Linton was not far behind. He opened the gate himself and sauntering slowly up, probably enjoying the lovely afternoon that breathed as soft as summer. "Now he is here," I exclaimed. "For heaven's sake, hurry down. You'll not meet anyone on the front stairs. Do be quick and stay among the trees till he is fairly in." "I must go, Cathy," said Heathcliff, seeking to extricate himself from his companion's arms. "But if I live, I'll see you again before you are asleep. I won't stray 5 yards from your window." "You must not go," she answered, holding him as firmly as her strength allowed. "You shall not, I tell you." "For 1 hour," he pleaded earnestly. "Not for 1 minute," she replied. "I must. Linton will be up immediately," persisted the alarmed intruder. He would have risen and unfixed her fingers by the act. She clung fast, gasping. There was mad resolution in her face. "No!" she shrieked. "Oh, don't go. It is the last time, Edgar. Edgar will not hurt us. Heathcliff, I shall die. "Damn the fool, there he is," cried Heathcliff, sinking back into his seat. "Hush, my darling, hush, Catherine, I'll stay. If he shot me so, I'd expire with a blessing on my lips." And there they were, fast again. I heard my masters mounting the stairs. Cold sweat ran from my forehead. I was horrified. "Are you going to listen to her ravings?" I said passionately. "She does not know what she says. Will you ruin her because she has not wit to help herself? Get up. You could be free instantly. That is the most diabolical deed that ever you did. We are all done for, master, mistress, and servant." I wrung my hands and cried out, and Mr. Linton hastened his step at the noise. In the midst of my agitation, I was sincerely glad to observe that Catherine's arms had fallen relaxed and her head hung down. "She's fainted or dead," I thought. "So much the better. Far better than she should be dead, than lingering a burden and misery maker to all about her." Edgar sprang to his unbidden guest, blanched with astonishment and rage. What he meant to do I cannot tell. However, the other stopped all demonstrations at once by placing the lifeless-looking form in his arms. "Look there," he said. "Unless you be a fiend, help her first, then you shall speak to me." He walked into the parlour and sat down. Mr. Linton summoned me, and with great difficulty and after resorting to many means, we managed to restore her to sensation, but she was all bewildered. She sighed and moaned and knew nobody. Edgar, in his anxiety for her, forgot her hated friend. I did not. I went at the earliest opportunity and besought him to depart, affirming that Catherine was better and he should hear from me in the morning how she passed the night. "I shall not refuse to go out of doors," he answered, "but I shall stay in the garden, and Nelly, mind you keep your word tomorrow. I shall be under those larch trees, mind, or I pay another visit, whether Linton be in or not." He sent a rapid glance through the half-open door of the chamber, and ascertaining that what I stated was apparently true, delivered the house of his luckless presence. See how long chapter 2 will be. Well, not very long at all. So we'll continue on. Let's have a little sip of my coffee. Oh, very nice. Part 2, Chapter 2. About 12 o'clock that night was born the Catherine you saw at Wuthering Heights, a puny 7 months child, and 2 hours after the mother died, having never recovered sufficient consciousness to miss Heathcliff or know Edgar. The latter's distraction at his bereavement, in a subject too painful to be dwelt on, its after-effects showed how deep the sorrow sunk. A great addition in my eyes was his being left without an heir. I bemoaned that, and as I gazed on the feeble orphan, and I mentally abused old Linton for, that was only natural partiality to securing his estate to his own daughter instead of his son's. An unwelcomed infant was, poor thing. It might have wailed out of life, and nobody cared a morsel. During those first hours of existence we redeemed the neglect afterwards, but its beginning was as friendless as its end is likely to be. Next morning, bright and cheerful out of doors, Stoll softened in through the blinds of the silent room and suffused the couch of its occupant with a mellow, tender glow. Edgar Linton had his head laid on the pillow and his eyes shut. His young and fair features were almost as death-like as those of the form beside him, and almost as fixed, but his was the hush of exhausted anguish, and hers perfect peace. Her brow smooth, her lids closed, her lips wearing the expression of a smile. No angel in heaven could be more beautiful than she appeared. And I partook of the infinite calm in which she lay. My mind was never in a holier frame than while I gazed on that untroubled image of divine rest. I instinctively echoed the words she had uttered a few hours before. Incomparably beyond and above us all, whether still on earth or now in heaven, her spirit is at home with God. I don't know if it be a peculiarity in me, but I am seldom otherwise than happy while watching in the chamber of death, should no frenzied or despairing mourner share the duty with me. I see a repose that neither earth nor hell can break, and I feel an assurance of the endless and shadowless hereafter, the eternity they have entered, where life is boundless in its duration, and love in its sympathy, and joy in its fullness. I notice on the occasion how much selfishness there is even in a love like Mr. Linton's, when he so regretted Catherine's blessed release. To be sure, one might have doubted, after the wayward and impatient existence she had led, whether she merited a haven of peace at last. One might doubt in seasons of cold reflection, but not then, in the presence of her corpse. It asserted its own tranquillity, which seemed a pledge of equal quiet to its former inhabitants. Do you believe such people are happy in the other world, sir? I'd give a great deal to know. I declined answering Mrs. Dean's question, which struck me as something heterodox. She proceeded, retracing the course of Catherine Linton, I fear we have no right to think she is, but will leave her with her Maker. The master looked asleep, and I ventured soon after sunrise to quit the room and steal out to the pure, refreshing air. The servants thought me gone to shake off the drowsiness and my protracted watch. In reality, my chief motive was seeing Mr. Heathcliff. If he had remained among the larches all night, he would have heard nothing of the stir of the Grange, unless perhaps he might catch the gallop of the messenger going to Gimmerton. If he had come nearer, he would probably be aware, from the lights flitting to and fro, and the opening and shutting of the outer doors, that all was not right within. I wished yet feared to find him. I felt the terrible news must be told, and I longed to get it over, but how to do it I did not know. He was there, at least a few yards further in the park, leant against an old ash tree, his hat off and his hair soaked with the dew that had gathered on the budded branches and fell pattering around him. He'd been standing a long time in that position, for I saw a pair of ousels passing and repassing, scarcely 3 feet from him, busy in building their nest, and regarding his proximity no more than that of a piece of timber. They flew off at my approach, and he raised his eyes and spoke. She's dead, he said. I've not waited for you to learn that. Put your handkerchief away. Don't snivel before me. Damn you all, she wants none of your tears. I was weeping as much for him as her. We do sometimes pity creatures that have none of the feeling of either for themselves or others, and when I first looked into his face, I perceived that he had got intelligence of the catastrophe, and a foolish notion struck me that his heart was quelled, and he prayed because his lips moved and his gaze was bent on the ground. Yes, she's dead, I answered, checking my sobs and drying my cheeks. Gone to heaven, I hope, where we may everyone join her, if we take due warning and leave our evil ways to follow good. Did she take due warning then? Asked Heathcliff, attempting a sneer. Did she die like a saint? Come, give me a true history of the event. How did... He endeavoured to pronounce the name, but could not manage it, and compressing his mouth, he held a silent combat with his own with his inward agony defying meanwhile my sympathy with an unflinching, ferocious stare. "How did she die?" he resumed at last, fain, notwithstanding his hardihood, to have a support behind him, for after the struggle he trembled in spite of himself to his very finger ends. Poor wretch, I thought, you have a heart and nerves the same as your brother, man. Why should you be so anxious to conceal them? Your pride cannot blind God. You tempt him to wring them till he forces a cry of humiliation. Quietly as a lamb, I answered aloud. She drew a sigh and stretched herself like a child reviving and sinking again to sleep, and 5 minutes after I felt one little pulse at her heart, and nothing more. And did she ever mention me?" he asked, hesitating, as if he dreaded the answer to his question would introduce details that he could not bear to hear. "Her senses never returned. She recognized nobody from the time you left her," I said. "She lies with a sweet smile on her face and the latest ideas wandering back to pleasant early days. Her life closed in a gentle dream. May she wake as kindly in the other world." "May she wake in torment," he cried with frightful vehemence, stamping his foot and groaning in a sudden paroxysm of ungovernable passion. "Why, she's a liar to the end. Where is she? Not there, not in heaven, not perished. Where? Oh, you said you cared nothing for my sufferings, and I pray one prayer. I repeat it till my tongue stiffens. Catherine Earnshaw, may you not rest as long as I am living. You said I killed you. Haunt me then. The murdered do haunt their murderers, I believe. I know that ghosts have wandered on earth. Be with me always, take any form, drive me mad, only do not leave me in this abyss where I cannot find you, O God. It is unutterable. I cannot live without my life. I cannot live without my soul." He dashed his head against the knotted trunk and, lifting up his eyes, howled, not like a man, but like a savage beast getting goaded to death with knives and spears. I observed several splashes of blood about the bark of the tree, and his hand and forehead were both stained, probably the scene I witnessed with a repetition of others acted during the night. It hardly moved my compassion, it appalled me. Still I felt reluctant to quit him so, but the moment he recollected himself enough to notice me watching, he thundered a command for me to go, and I obeyed. It was beyond my skill and to quiet or console. Mrs. Linton's funeral was appointed to take place on the Friday following her decease, and till then her coffin remained uncovered and strewn with flowers and scented leaves in the great drawing-room. Linton spent his days and nights there, a sleepless guardian, and, a circumstance concealed from all but me, Heathcliff spent his nights, at least outside, equally a stranger to repose. I held no communication with him, still I was conscious of his design to enter, if he could, and on the Tuesday, a little after dark, when my master from sheer fatigue had been compelled to retire a couple of hours, I went and opened one of the windows, moved by his perseverance, to give him a chance of bestowing on the fading image of his idol one final adieu. He did not omit to avail himself of the opportunity. Cautiously and briefly, too cautiously to betray his presence by the slightest noise. Indeed, I should have discovered that he had been there, except for the disarrangement of the drapery about the corpse's face, and for observing on the floor a curl of light hair fastened with a silver thread, which on examination I ascertained to have been taken from a locket hung round Catherine's neck. Heathcliff had opened the trinket and cast out its contents, replacing them by a black lock of his own. I twisted the two and enclosed them together. Mr. Earnshaw was, of course, invited to attend the remains of his sister to the grave, and he sent no excuse, but he never came, so that besides her husband, the mourners were wholly composed of tenants and servants. Isabella was not asked. The place of Catherine's interment, to the surprise of the villagers, was neither in the chapel under the carved monument of the Lintons, nor yet by the tombs of her own relations outside. It was dug on a green slope in a corner of the kirkyard, where the wall is so low that heath and bilberry plants have climbed over it from the moor, and peat mould almost buries it. Her husband lies in the same spot now, and they have each a simple headstone above and a plain grey block at their feet to mark their graves. And chapter 3 is extremely long, and I will be reading it right now. Oh, that's a good coffee. I think I'll change sitting positions though. I'm getting a bit uncomfortable. Whoop. On the charger here. Excuse me. Shall I? So I think I'll probably unplug it from the charger. Is it still filming? Yes, it is. Bring her a little bit closer. Yes, well, chapter 3 of part 2. That Friday made the last of our fine days for a month. In the evening the weather broke, the wind shifted from south to northeast and brought rain first and then sleet and snow. On the morrow one could hardly imagine that there had been 3 weeks of summer. The primroses and crocuses were hidden under wintry drifts. The larks were silent, the young leaves of the early trees smitten and blackened, and dreary and chill and dismal that morrow did creep over. My master kept his room. I took possession of the lonely parlour, converting it into a nursery, and there I was sitting with the moaning doll of a child laid at my knee, rocking it to and fro and watching. Meanwhile, the still driving flakes spilled upon the uncurtained window, when the door opened and some person entered, out of breath and laughing. My anger was greater than my astonishment. For a minute I supposed it one of the maids, and I cried, "Have done! How dare you show your giddiness here? What would Mr. Linton say if he heard you?" "Excuse me," answered a familiar voice, "but I know Edgar is in bed, and I cannot stop myself." With that the speaker came forward to the fire, panting and holding her hand to her side. "I have run the whole way from Wuthering Heights," she continued after a pause. "Except where I've flown, I couldn't count the number of falls I've had. Oh, I'm aching all over. Don't be alarmed. There shall be an explanation as soon as I can give it. Only just have the goodness to step out and order the carriage to take me to the Gimmerton, and tell a servant to seek up a few clothes in my wardrobe." The intruder was Mrs. Heathcliff. She certainly seemed in no laughing predicament. Her hair streamed on her shoulders, dripping with snow and water. She was dressed in the girlish dress she commonly wore, befitting her age more than her position, a low frock with short sleeves, nothing on either head or neck. The frock was of a light silk and clung to her wet, and her feet were protected merely by thin slippers. Add to this a deep cut under one ear, which only the cold prevented from bleeding profusely. Pardon me. A white face scratched and bruised, and a frame hardly able to support herself through fatigue. And you may fancy my first fright was not much allayed when I had leisure to examine her. "My dear young lady," I exclaimed, "I'll stir nowhere and hear nothing till you have removed every article of your clothes and put on dry things, and certainly you shall not go to Gimmerton tonight, so it is needless to order the carriage." "Certainly I shall," she said.
walking or riding, yet I've no objection to dress myself decently, and see how it flows down my neck now. The fire does make it smart. She insisted on my fulfilling her directions before she would let me touch her, and not till after the coachman had been instructed to get ready and the maid set to pack up some necessary attire did I obtain her consent for binding the wound and helping to change her garments. "Now, Ellen," she said, when my task was finished and she was seated in an easy chair on the hearth with a cup of tea before her, "you sit down opposite me and put poor Catherine's baby away. I don't like to see it. You mustn't think I care little for Catherine because I have behaved so foolishly on entering. I've cried too bitterly, yes, more than anyone else has reason to cry. We parted unreconciled. You remember, and I shan't forgive myself, but for all that, I was not going to sympathise with him, the brute beast. Oh, give me the poker. This is the last thing of this I have about me." She slipped the gold ring from her third finger and threw it on the floor. "I'll smash it," she continued, striking with childish spite, "and then I'll burn it," and took it and dropped the misused article among the coals. "There, he shall buy another if he gets me back again. He'd be capable of coming to seek me to tease Edgar. I dare not stay, lest the notion should possess his wicked head. And besides, Edgar has not been kind, has he? And I won't be suing for his assistance, nor will I bring him into more trouble. Necessity compelled me to seek shelter here. Although I had not learned he was out of the way, I'd have halted at the kitchen, washed my face, warmed myself, got you to bring out what I wanted, and departed again to anywhere out of reach of my accursed, of that incarnate goblin. Oh, he was in such a fury. If he had caught me, it's a pity. Earnshaw is not his match in strength. I wouldn't have run till I'd seen him all but demolished had Hindley been able to do it." "Well, don't talk so fast, miss," I interrupted. "You'll disorder the handkerchief I've tied around your face, and make the cut bleed again. Drink your tea and take breath, and give over laughing. Laughter is sadly out of place under this roof, and in your condition." "An undeniable truth," she replied. "Listen to that child. It maintains a constant wail. Set it out of my hearing for an hour. I shan't stay any longer." I rang the bell and committed it to the servant's care, and when I required that he had urged her to escape from Wuthering Heights in such an unlikely plight, and where she meant to go, as she refused remaining with us. "I ought and I wish to remain," answered she, "to cheer Edgar and take care of the baby, for two things, and because the Grange is my right home, but I tell you, he wouldn't let me. Do you think he could bear to see me grow fat and merry, and could bear to think that we were now tranquil and not resolve on poisoning our comfort? Now, I have the satisfaction of being sure that he detests me to the point of its annoying him seriously to have me within earshot or eyesight. I notice, when I enter his presence, the muscles of his countenance are involuntarily distorted into an expression of hatred, partly arising from his knowledge of the good causes I feel to sentiment for him, and partly from original aversion, is strong enough to make me feel pretty certain that he would not chase me over England, supposing I contrived a clear escape, and therefore I must get quite away. I've recovered from my first desire to be killed by him. I'd rather he'd kill himself. He has extinguished my love effectually, and so I'm at my ease. I can recollect yet how I loved him, and can dimly imagine that I could still be loving him, even if he had doted on me, the devilish nature would have revealed its existence somehow. Catherine had an awfully perverted taste to esteem him so dearly, knowing him so well. Monster! Would that he could be blotted out of creation and out of my memory. "Hush, hush, he's a human being," I said. "Be more charitable. There are worse men than he is yet." "He's not a human being," she retorted, "and he had no claim on my charity. I gave him my heart, and he took and pinched it to death, and flung it back at me. People feel with their hearts, Ellen, and since he has destroyed mine, I have not power to feel for him, and I would not, though he groaned from this to this dying day, and wept tears of blood for Catherine. No, indeed, I wouldn't." And here Isabella began to cry, but immediately dashing the water from her lashes, she recommenced. You asked, what has driven me to flight at last? I was compelled to attempt it because I had succeeded in rousing his rage, a pitch above his malignity. Pulling out the nerves with his red-hot pincers required more coolness than knocking on the head. He was worked up to forget the fiendish prudence he boasted of, and proceeding to murderous violence. I experienced pleasure in being able to exasperate him. The sense of pleasure woke my instinct of self-preservation, so I fairly broke free, and if I ever come into his hands again, he is welcome to a signal revenge. Yesterday, you know, Mr. Earnshaw should have been at the funeral. He kept himself sober for the purpose, tolerably sober, not going to bed mad at 6 o'clock and getting up drunk at 12. Consequently, he rose in suicidal low spirits, as fit for the church as for a dance, and instead he sat down by the fire and swallowed gin or brandy by tumblefuls. Heathcliff, I shudder to name him, has been a stranger in the house from last Sunday till today. Whether the angels have fed him or his kin beneath, I cannot tell, but he has not eaten a meal with us for nearly a week. He just came home at dawn and gone upstairs to his chamber, locking himself in, as if nobody dreamt of coveting his company. There he has continued praying like a Methodist. Only the deity he implored its senseless dust and ashes, and God, when addressed, when curiously confounded with his own black father. After concluding these precious orisons, and they lasted generally till he grew hoarse, and his voice was strangled in his throat, he would be off again, always straight down to the Grange. I wonder Edgar did not send for a constable and give him into custody. For me, grieved as I was about Catherine, it was impossible to avoid regarding the season of deliverance from degrading oppression as a holiday. I recovered spirits sufficient to hear Joseph's eternal lectures about weeping, and to move up and down the house less with the foot of a frightened thief than formerly. You wouldn't think that I should cry at anything Joseph could say, but he and Hareton are detestable companions. I'd rather sit with Hindley and hear his awful talk than with the little master and his staunch supporter, that odious old man. When Heathcliff is in, I'm often obliged to seek the kitchen and their society, or starve among the damp, uninhabited chambers when he is not. As was the case this week, I establish a table and chair at the corner of the house fire, and never mind how Mr. Earnshaw may occupy himself. And he does not interfere with my arrangements. He is quieter now than he used to be. If no one provokes him, more sullen and depressed and less furious. Joseph affirms he's sure he's an altered man, that the Lord has touched his heart, and he is saved, so as by fire. I'm puzzled to detect signs of the favourable change, but it is not my business. Yesterday evening I sat in my nook reading some old books till late on toward 12. It seemed so dismal to go upstairs, with the wild snow blowing outside and my thoughts continually reverting to the kirkyard and the new-made grave. I dared hardly lift my eyes from the page before me, that melancholy scene so instantly usurped its place. Hindley sat opposite, his head leant on his hand, perhaps meditating on the same subject. He'd ceased drinking at that point below irrationality, and had neither stirred nor spoken during 2 or 3 hours. There was no sound through the house, but the moaning wind, which shook the windows every now and then, the faint crackling of the coals, and the click of my snuffers as I removed at intervals the long wick of the candle. Hareton and Joseph were probably fast asleep in bed. It was very, very sad, and while I read, I sighed, for it seemed as if all joy had vanished from the world, never to be restored. The doleful silence was broken at length by the sound of the kitchen latch. Heathcliff had returned from his watch earlier than usual, owing, I suppose, to the sudden storm. That entrance was fastened, and we heard him coming round to get in by the other. I rose with an irrepressible expression of what I felt on my lips, which induced my companion, who had been staring towards the door, to turn and look at me. "I'll keep him out 5 minutes," he exclaimed. "You won't object?" "No, you may keep him out the whole night for me," I answered. "Do. Put the key in the lock and draw the bolts." Earnshaw accomplished this ere his guest reached the front. He then came and brought his chair to the other side of my table, leaning over it, and searching in my eyes a sympathy with the burning hate that gleamed from his. As he both looked and felt like an assassin, he couldn't exactly find that, but he discovered enough to encourage him to speak. "You and I," he said, "have each a great debt to settle with the man out yonder. If we were neither of us cowards, we might combine to discharge it. Are you as soft as your brother? Are you willing to endure to the last and not once attempt a repayment?" "I'm weary of enduring now," I replied, "and I'd be glad of a retaliation that wouldn't recoil on myself, but treachery and violence are spears pointed at both ends. They wound those who resort to them worse than their enemies." "Treachery and violence are a just return for treachery and violence," cried Hindley. "Mrs. Heathcliff, I'll ask you to do nothing but sit still and be dumb. Tell me now, can you? I'm sure you would have as much pleasure as I in witnessing the conclusion of a friend's existence. He'll be your death unless you overreach him, and he'll be my ruin. Damn the hellish villain! He knocks at the door as if he were the master here already. Promise to hold your tongue, and before that clock strikes, if you want 3 minutes of one, you're a free woman." He took the implements which I described to you in my letter from his breast, and would have turned down the candle. I snatched it away, however, and seized his arm. "I'll not hold my tongue," I said. "You mustn't touch him. Let the door remain shut and be quiet." "No, I've informed my resolution, and by God I'll execute it," cried the desperate being. "I'll do you a kindness in spite of yourself and Hareton justice, and you needn't trouble your head to screen me. Catherine is gone. Nobody alive would regret me or be ashamed, though I cut my throat this minute, and it's time to make an end. I might as well have struggled with a bear or reasoned with a lunatic. The only resource left me was to run to a lattice and warn his intended victim of the fate which awaited him. "You'd better seek shelter somewhere else tonight," I exclaimed in a rather triumphant tone. "Mr. Earnshaw has a mind to shoot you if you persist in endeavouring to enter." "You'd better open the door, he answered, addressing me by some elegant term that I don't care to repeat. "I shall not meddle in the matter," I retorted again. "Come in and get shot if you please. I've done my duty." With that I shut the windows and returned to my place by the fire, having too small a stock of hypocrisy at my command to pretend any anxiety for the danger that menaced him. Earnshaw swore passionately at me, affirming that I loved the villain yet, and calling me all sorts of names for the base spirit I had evinced. And I, in my secret heart, and conscience never reproached me, thought what a blessing it would be for him should Heathcliff put him out of misery, and what a blessing for me should he send Heathcliff to his right abode. As I sat nursing these reflections, the casement behind me was banged on the floor by a blow from the latter individual, and his black countenance looked blightingly through. The stanchion stood too close to suffer his shoulder to follow, and I smiled, exulting in my fancied security. His hair and clothes were whitened with snow, and his sharp cannibal teeth, revealed by cold and wrath, gleamed through the dark. "Isabella, let me in, or I'll make you repent," he gurned, as Joseph calls it. "I cannot commit murder," I replied. "Mr. Hindley stands sentinel with a knife and loaded pistol." "Let me in the kitchen door," he said. "Hindley will be there before me," I answered, "and that's a poor love of yours that cannot bear a shower of snow. We were left at peace in our beds as long as the summer moon shone, but the moment a blast of winter returns you must run for shelter, Heathcliff. If I were you, I'd go stretch myself over her grave and die like a faithful dog. The world is surely not worth living in now, is it? You had distinctly impressed on me the idea that Catherine was the whole joy of your life. I can't imagine how you think of surviving her loss." "He's there, is he?" exclaimed my companion, rushing to the gap. "If I can get my arm out, I can hit him. I'm afraid, Ellen, you'll set me down as really wicked, But you don't know all, so don't judge. I wouldn't have aided or abetted an attempt on even his life. For anything wish that we were dead I must, and therefore I was fearfully disappointed, and unnerved by terror for the consequences of my taunting speech when he flung himself on Earnshaw's weapon and wrenched it from his grasp. The charge exploded, and the knife, in springing back, closed into its owner's wrist. Heathcliff pulled it away by main force, slitting up the flesh as it passed on, and thrust it dripping into his pocket, and then took a stone, struck down the division between the two windows, and sprung in. His adversary had fallen senseless with excessive pain, and the flow of blood that gushed from an artery or a large vein. The ruffian kicked and trampled on him, and dashed his head repeatedly against the flags, holding me with one hand meantime to prevent me summoning Joseph. He exerted preterhuman self-denial in abstaining from finishing him completely, but getting out of breath, he finally desisted and dragged the apparently inanimate body onto the settle. There he tore off the sleeve of Earnshaw's coat and bound up the wound with brutal roughness, spitting and cursing during the operation as energetically as he had kicked before. Being at liberty, I lost no time in seeking the old servant, who, having gathered by degrees the purport of my hasty tale, hurried below, gasping as he descended the steps two at once. What is there to do now? What is there to do now? There's this to do, thundered Heathcliff, that your master's mad, and should he last another month, I'll have him to an asylum. How the devil did you come fasten me out, you toothless hound? Don't stand muttering and mumbling here. Come, I'm not going to nurse him. Wash that stuff away and mind your sparks of your candle. It is more than half brandy. On so you be muttering on him, exclaimed Joseph, lifting his hands and eyes in horror. If ever a seat like this may the Lord. Heathcliff gave him a push onto his knees in the middle of the blood and flung a towel to him, but instead of proceeding to dry it up, he joined his hands and began a prayer which excited my laughter from its odd phraseology. I was in the condition of mind to be shocked at nothing. In fact, I was as reckless as some malefactors show themselves at the foot of the gallows. Oh, I forgot you, said the tyrant. You should do that. Down with you. And you conspire with him against me, do you, viper? There, that is work fit for you. He shook me till my teeth rattled and pitched me beside Joseph, who steadily concluded his supplications and then rose, vowing he would set off for the Grange directly. Mr. Linton was a magistrate, and though he had 50 wives dead, he should inquire into this. He was so obstinate in his resolution that Heathcliff deemed it expedient to compel from my lips a recapitulation of what had taken place, standing over me, heaving with malevolence, as I reluctantly delivered the answer to his questions. It required a great deal of labour to satisfy the old man that he was not the aggressor, especially with my hardy-rung replies. However, Mr. Earnshaw soon convinced him that he was alive still. He hastened to administer a dose of spirits, and by their succour his master presently regained motion and consciousness. Heathcliff, aware that he was ignorant of the treatment received while insensible, called him deliriously intoxicated, and said he should not notice his atrocious conduct further, but advised him to get to bed. To my joy, he left us after giving his judicious counsel, and Hindley stretched himself on the hearthstone. I departed to my own room, marvelling that I had escaped so easily. This morning, when I came down about half an hour before noon, Mr. Earnshaw was sitting by the fire, deadly sick. His evil genius, almost a gaunt and ghastly, leant against the chimney. Neither appeared inclined to dine, and having waited till the old cold was on the table, I commenced alone. Nothing hindered me from eating heartily, and I experienced a certain sense of satisfaction and superiority as, at intervals, I cast look towards my silent companions and felt the comfort of a quiet conscience within me. After I had done, I ventured on the usual liberty of drawing near the fire, going round Earnshaw's seat, and kneeling in the corner beside him. Heathcliff did not glance my way, and as I gazed up, and contemplated his features almost as confidently as they had been turned to stone. His forehead, that I once thought so manly, and that I now think so diabolical, was shaded with a heavy cloud. His basilisk eyes were nearly quenched by sleepiness, and weeping perhaps, for the lashes were wet then, his lips devoid of their ferocious sneer, and sealed in an expression of unspeakable sadness. Had it been another, I would have covered my face in the presence of such grief. In his case I was gratified, and ignoble of it seems to insult a fallen enemy. I couldn't miss this chance of sticking in a dart. His weakness was the only time when I could taste the delight of paying wrong for wrong. Fie, fie, miss, I interrupted. One might suppose you had never opened a Bible in your life. If God afflict your enemies, surely that ought to suffice you. It is both mean and presumptuous to add your torture to his. In general, I'll allow that it will be, Ellen, she continued. That misery laid on Heathcliff could content me, unless I had a hand in it. I'd rather he suffered less, if I might cause his sufferings, and he might know that I was the cause. Oh, I owe him so much. On only one condition can I hope to forgive him. It is, if I may take an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, for every wrench of agony, return a wrench, reduce him to my level. As he was the first to injure, make him the first to implore pardon, and then, why then, Ellen, I might show you some generosity, but it is utterly impossible I can ever be revenged, and therefore I cannot forgive him. Hindley wanted some water, and I handed him a glass and asked him how he was. Not as ill as I wished, he replied, but leaving out my arm, every inch of me is as sore as if I'd been fighting with a legion of imps. Yes, no wonder, was my next remark. Catherine used to boast that she stood between you and bodily harm. She meant that certain persons would not hurt you for fear of offending her. It's well people don't really rise from their grave, or last night she might have witnessed a repulsive scene. Are not you bruised and cut over your chest and shoulders? I can't say, he answered. But what do you mean? Did he dare to strike me when I was down? He trampled on and kicked you, and dashed you on the ground, I whispered, and his mouth watered to tear you with his teeth, because he's only half a man, not so much. Mr. Earnshaw looked up like me to the countenance of our mutual foe, who, absorbed in his anguish, seemed insensible to anything around him. The longer he stood, the plainer his reflections revealed their blackness through his features. Oh, if God would but give me strength to strangle him in my last agony, I'd go to hell with joy, groaned the impatient man, writhing with rise and sinking back in despair, convinced of his inadequacy for the struggle. Nay, it's enough that he has murdered one of you, I observed aloud. At the Grange, everyone knows your sister would have been living now, had it not been for Mr. Heathcliff. After all, it is preferable to be hated than loved by him. When I recollect how happy we were, how happy Catherine was before he came, I am fit to curse the day. Most likely Heathcliff noticed more the truth of what was said than the spirit of the person who said it. His attention was roused, I saw, for his eyes rained down tears among the ashes, and he drew his breath in suffocating sighs. I stared full at him and laughed scornfully. The clouded windows of hell flashed a moment towards me. The fiend which usually looked out, however, was so dimmed and drowned that I did not fear the hazard another sound of derision. Get up and be gone out of my sight, said the mourner. I guessed he uttered those words at least, though his voice was hardly intelligible. I beg your pardon, I replied, but I loved Catherine too, and her brother requires attendance which, for her sake, I shall supply. Now that she's dead, I see her in Hindley. Hindley has exactly her eyes, if you had not tried to gouge them out and made them black and red. And her, get up, wretched idiot, before I stamp you to death, he cried, making a movement that caused me to make one also. But then I continued, holding myself ready to flee. If poor Catherine had trusted you, and assumed the ridiculous, contemptible, degrading title of Mrs. Heathcliff, she would soon have presented a similar picture. She wouldn't have borne you abominable behaviour quietly. Her detestation and disgust must have found voice. The back of the settle of Earnshaw's person interposed between me and him. So instead of endeavouring to reach me, he snatched a dinner knife from the table and flung it at my head. It struck beneath my ear and stopped the sentence I was uttering. But pulling it out, I sprang to the door and delivered another, which I hope went a little deeper than his missile. The last glimpse I caught of him was a furious rush on his part, checked by the embrace of his host, and both fell locked together on the hearth. In my flight through the kitchen, I bid Joseph speed to his master. I knocked over Hareton, who was hanging a litter of puppies from a chair back in the doorway, and blessed as a soul escaped from purgatory, I bounded, leaped, and flew down the step road. Then, quitting its windings, shot direction across the moor, rolling over banks and wading through marshes, precipitating myself, in fact, towards the beacon light of the Grange, and far rather would I be condemned to a perpetual dwelling in the infernal regions than even for one night abide beneath the roof of Wuthering Heights again. Isabella ceased speaking and took a drink of tea. Then she rose, and bidding me put on her bonnet and a great shawl I had brought, and turning the deaf ear to my entreaties for her to remain another hour, she stepped onto a chair, kissed Edgar and Catherine's portraits, bestowed a similar salute on me, and descended to the carriage, accompanied by Fanny, who yelped wild with joy at recovering her mistress. She was driven away, never to revisit this neighbourhood, but a regular correspondence was established between her and my master when things were more settled. I believe her new abode was in the south, near London. There she had a son born a few months subsequent to her escape. He was christened Linton, and from the first she reported him to be an ailing, peevish creature. Mr. Heathcliff, meeting me on the day in the village, inquired where she lived. I refused to tell. He remarked that it was not of any moment, only she must be aware of coming to her brother. She should not be with him if he had to keep her himself. Though I would give no information, he discovered, through some of the other servants, both her place and residence, and the existence of the child. Still he didn't molest her, for which forbearance she might thank his aversion, I suppose. He often asked about the infant when he saw me, and on hearing its name smiled grimly and observed, "They wish me to hate it too, do they?" "I don't think they wish you to know anything about it," I answered. "But I'll have it," he said, "when I want it. They may reckon on that." Fortunately, its mother died before the time arrived, some 13 years after the decease of Catherine, when Linton was 12, or a little more. On the day succeeding Isabella's unexpected visit, I had no opportunity of speaking to my master. He shunned conversation and was fit for discussing nothing. When I could get him to listen, I saw it pleased him that his sister had left her husband, whom he abhorred with an intensity with the mildness of his nature would scarcely seem to allow, so deep and sensitive was his aversion that he refrained from going anywhere where he was likely to see or hear of Heathcliff. Grief and that together transformed him into a complete hermit. He threw up his office of magistrate, ceased even to attend church, avoided the village on all occasions, and spent a life of entire seclusion within the limits of his park and grounds, only varied by solitary rambles on the moors and visits to the grave of his wife, mostly at evening or early morning before other wanderers were abroad. But he was too good to be thoroughly unhappy long. He didn't pray for Catherine's soul to haunt him. Time brought resignation and a melancholy sweeter than common joy. He recalled her memory with ardent tender love and hopeful aspiring to the better world where, he doubted not, she was gone. And he had earthly consolation and affections also. For a few days, I said, he seemed regardless of the puny successor to the departed. The coldness melted as fast as snow in April, and ere the tiny thing could stammer a word or totter a step, it wielded a despot's sceptre in his heart. It was named Catherine, but he never called it the name in full, and he had never called the first Catherine short, probably because Heathcliff had a habit of doing so. The little one was always Cathy. It formed to him a distinction from the mother, and yet a connection with her, and his attachment sprang from its revelation to her, far more than from its being his own. I used to draw a comparison between him and Hindley Earnshaw and perplex myself to explain satisfactorily why their contact was so opposite in similar circumstances. They had both been fond husbands and were both attached to their children, and I could not see how they shouldn't have both taken the same road for good or evil. But I thought in my mind Hindley, with apparently the stronger head, has shown himself sadly the worse and the weaker man. When the ship struck, the captains abandoned his post, and the crew, instead of trying to save her, rushed into riot and confusion, leaving no hope for their luckless vessel. Linton, on the contrary, displayed the true courage of a loyal and faithful soul. He trusted God, and God comforted him. One hoped, and the other despaired. They chose their own lots and were righteously doomed to endure them. But you'll not want to hear my moralizing, Mr. Lockwood. You'll judge as well as I can all these things at least. You'll think you will, and that's the same. The end of Earnshaw was what might have been expected. It followed fast on his sisters. There was scarcely 6 months between them. We at the Grange never got a very succinct account of his state preceding it. All that I did learn was an occasion of going to the aid of preparations for the funeral. Mr. Kenneth came to announce the event to my master. "Well, Nelly," said he, riding into the yard one morning, too early not to alarm me with an instant presentiment of bad news, "it's yours and my turn to go into mourning at present. Who's given us the slip now, do you think?" "Who?" I asked in a flurry. "Why, guess," he returned, dismounting and slinging his bridle on a hook by the door. "And nip up the corner of your apron. I'm certain you'll need it." "Not Mr. Heathcliff, surely," I exclaimed. "What? Would you have tears for him?" said the doctor. "No, Heathcliff's a tough young fellow. He looks blooming today. I've just seen him. He's rapidly regaining flesh since he lost his better half." "Who is it then, Mr. Kenneth?" I replied impatiently. "Hindley Earnshaw, your old friend Hindley," he replied, "and my wicked gossip, though he's been too wild for me this long while. There, I said we should draw water, but cheer up. He died true to his character, drunk as a lord, poor lad. I'm sorry, too, one can't help missing an old companion, though he had the worst tricks with him that ever man imagined, and has done me many a rascally turn. He's barely 27, it seems. That's your own age. Who would have thought you were born in 1 year? I confess this blow was greater to me than the shock of Mr. Linton's death. Ancient associations lingered around my heart. I sat down in the porch and wept as for a blood relation, desiring Kenneth to get another servant to introduce him to the master. I could not hinder myself from pondering on the question. Had he had fair play? Whatever I did, that idea would bother me. It was so tiresomely pertinacious that I resolved on requesting leave to go to Wuthering Heights and assist in the last duties to the dead. Mr. Linton was extremely reluctant to consent, but I pleaded eloquently for the friendless condition in which he lay, and I said my old master and foster brother had a claim on my services as strong as his own. Besides, I reminded him that the child, Hareton, was his wife's nephew, and in the absence of near akin he ought to act as its guardian, and he ought to, and must inquire how the property was left, and look over the concerns of his brother-in-law. He was unfit for attending to such matters then, but he bid me speak to his lawyer, and at length permitted me to go. His lawyer had been Earnshaw's also. I called at the village and asked him to accompany me. He shook his head and advised that Heathcliff should be let alone, affirming if this truth were known, Hareton would be found little else than a beggar. His father died in debt, he said. The whole property is mortgaged, and the sole chance of the natural heir is to allow him an opportunity of creating some interest in the creditor's heart, that he may be inclined to deal leniently towards him. When I reached the Heights, I explained that I had come to see everything carried out decently, and Joseph, who appeared in sufficient distress, expressed satisfaction at my presence. Mr. Heathcliff said he did not perceive that I was wanted, but I might stay and order the arrangements for the funeral if I chose. Correctly, he remarked, that fool's body should be buried at the crossroads without ceremony of any kind. I happened to leave him 10 minutes yesterday afternoon, and in that interval he fastened the two doors of the house against me, and he spent the night in drinking himself to death deliberately. We broke in this morning, and we heard him snorting like a horse. And there he was, laid over the settle. Flaying and scalping would not have wakened him. I sent for Kenneth, and he came, but not till the beast had changed into carrion. He was both dead and cold and stark, and so you'll allow it useless making more stir about him. The old servant confirmed this statement, but muttered, "Or'd you rather he'd go and hustle for the doctor, or say to tend to Maister better know him, and he weren't dead when I left him, not a snort." I insisted at the funeral being respectable. Mr. Heathcliff said I might have my own way there too, only he desired me to remember that the money for the whole affair came out of his pocket. He maintained a hard, careless deportment, indicative of neither joy nor sorrow. If anything, it expressed a flinty gratification at a piece of difficult work, successfully executed. I observed once, indeed, something like exultation in his aspect. It was just when the people were bearing the coffin from the house he had the hypocrisy to represent a mourner, and previous to following with Hareton, he lifted the unfortunate child onto the table and muttered with peculiar gusto, "Now, my bonny lad, you are mine, and we'll see if one tree won't grow as crooked as another, with the same wind to twist it." The unsuspecting thing was pleased at his perch. He played with Heathcliff's whiskers and stroked his cheek, but I divined its meaning and observed tartly, "That boy must go back with me to Thrushcross Grange, sir. There is nothing in this world less yours than he is." "Does Linton say so?" he demanded. "Of course he has ordered me to take him," I replied. "Well," said the scoundrel, "we'll not argue the subject now, but I have no fancy to try my hand at rearing a young one so intimate to your master that I must supply the place of this with my own. If he attempt to remove it, I don't engage to let Hareton go undisputed, but I'll be pretty sure to make the other come. Remember to tell him." This hint was enough to bind our hands. I repeated its substance on my return, and Edgar Linton, little interested at the commencement, spoke no more of interfering. I'm not aware that he could have done it to any purpose, had he been ever so willing. The guest was now the master of Wuthering Heights. He held firm possession, and proved to the attorney, who in his turn proved it to Mr. Linton, that Earnshaw had mortgaged every yard of land he owned for cash to supply his mania for gaming, and he, Heathcliff, was the mortgagee. In that manner, Hareton, who should now be the first gentleman in the neighbourhood, was reduced to a state of complete dependence on his father's inveterate enemy, and lives in his own house as a servant, deprived of the advantage of wages, and quite unable to right himself, because of his friendlessness and his ignorance that he has been wronged. So that was the end of chapter 3. Chapter 3 of part 2 of Wuthering Heights. And we'll leave it there for today. Hope you enjoyed that, besties. And if you'd like me to continue reading that, please leave me a comment below or send me an email. Okay, bye, besties.